Hello there, and welcome. Well, I'm going to try to approach this episode again. I've already tried to record this episode, and it didn't go very well. This is a more complicated subject than I usually deal with, and so I'm going to try it again and see if I can't do a little better job. So, let's start with some history. And I think part of the reason I'm struggling with this is I would love it if my brother John and I could discuss this together, because of course he was the more experienced historian between the two of us. But, that's just not possible. So you're going to have to just depend on me sort of working my way through this subject as best I can. Public schools are really an outgrowth of the impulse to protect children. So, near the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of poor children were being exploited as a type of slave labor in mines and textile factories, and they were being used up in their babyhood, essentially. And so there was a group of wealthy, mostly women, although there were men involved too, of course, who wanted to end this exploitative practice of using children as slave labor. And so the idea of a public school became a possibility. And the way they sold it to people who had less compassion for little poor children was, look, what we really need is a working class that can read and write and do arithmetic, because they'll be better employees. Since we're entering a period where we're going to ask our workers to do more and more mind work rather than simple brute work, we're going to need to educate our workforce. So before children enter that workforce, let's get them to read and write and do arithmetic. So that's how it's sold, and that's how it gets the backing of the communities around the country. And so it works. And the surprising thing is the way they sold the idea actually was good, because it turned out that yes, if a workforce can read and write and do arithmetic, it's a better workforce. And you end up with children having actual childhoods, and you don't actually employ human beings until they're nearly adults or adults. So that's kind of the background. Now, the same time that all this, the Industrial Revolution and the development of public education was going on, the end of the Civil War was happening in our wonderful United States, which were united again. And in that time period, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified. And if that amendment doesn't ring a bell, it's the Citizenship Amendment. And it had really two main points. It asserted that people born into slavery were now equal citizens. They were no longer slaves, they were citizens. And that anybody born within the country was a citizen. That's birthright citizenship. And this was kind of important. It was important from the inception. It was important from the time of the Revolutionary War, this idea of citizenship, because, of course, those first revolutionaries were citizens of the British Crown. They belonged to the Crown. And they fought the revolution in order to start a new type of citizenry. So this 1868 ratification led to all sorts of angst in the South. Most of us who've studied any part of history understand that what the 14th Amendment did was fix a travesty of the original constitutional documentation, which made slaves 3/5 of a person, which was an evil and obscene allowance. because of course they were full people. They were people. And that was made to placate wealthy and powerful white men that owned slaves. So, that may be an uncomfortable subject for some people, but that's just the way it is. And that's part of why I miss John, is he really knew this stuff better, much better than I do, right off the top of my head. So, the next big important case that relates to school was decided in 1896, and that was Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson actually had to do with trains. There was a man, I think his name was Homer Plessy, who was, in the case, described as 7/8 white. So he had decided that he was going to ride in a white rail car. And he was told to get up and move to the colored rail car. And he refused and was arrested. And his case went to the Supreme Court. So this is not a huge amount of time from the Civil War. And the court decided that if people were provided separate but equal places in public spaces, then it was okay to segregate the races. That was their decision. And it was a terrible one. Okay? It was just a bad decision. And I think most people who, when it came down, if they thought about it for any amount of time, thought, well, that's just not going to work. Because even at that point in history, and even with the argument that was made, separate but equal isn't a real thing. That's not how it works. It wasn't working that way then. It never worked that way. Separate inherently is not equal. Okay? And so it wasn't until 1954 that the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was decided, in which that doctrine of separate but equal was held up to the light of the Constitution and shown to be flawed. It's false. Because you can't have equal protection under the law, you can't have equal blessing of right if you separate people all the time. There has to be true equality. People have to be allowed to mix. You have to allow people to use the same facilities. So, of course, part of this arose from schools, public schools, because in Brown versus Board of Education, it was about the public schools. It fought the doctrine of separate but equal because it was so apparent when it came to talking about children. You could tell that the little children in segregated schools were not getting the benefits that little children in white schools were. So there was no argument to be had, really. It was a unanimous decision from the court that separate but equal must be vacated. Well, just look at a collection of Norman Rockwell prints and you'll see how this went down in some areas of the country. But still, desegregation started taking place, and that meant that students were going to be bused into these desegregated schools. And guess what happened? Well, there was a lot of fit throwing, but here's the shocker. When these schools were mixed, racially, culturally, socioeconomically, every group did better academically. Not just the minority groups, not just African American kids or Latino kids or Native American. It wasn't just them that did better. Everybody did better. Our ascendancy in our public educational school system was during that busing time. That's when we saw the greatest gains among young people. But here's the shock. That same time, a very slow process began again, and that was called white flight, where white members in the community would move away from a community as it became more diverse, as Black and Latino and different cultural families moved in. White native dwellers, white Americans, would move to white neighborhoods. So it created a de facto resegregation system. And that's where you kind of see that for some people, it's not the academics that matter. For some people, it's the privilege that matters. For some people, they really do believe it's not what you know, it's who you know. And they want to keep those levers of power and wealth closed into a community they have access to so that their privilege is sustained. Now, I was one of those people that didn't care about what color or shape or size or style of kid I was teaching. As long as they improved, I was working for it. That's what I wanted to see. I wanted to see everybody do well. And most public school teachers think that way, even today. And what you'll see now is a lot of schools are being told, well, they're terrible, so we're going to get vouchers and we're going to pull the money out of these integrated schools and we're going to put it into private and charter schools where there aren't as many of these people that we don't want our kids to mix with, that we don't want to have anywhere near the levers of power in the community. So this push-pull of equality versus privilege has been going on all along. It's something that I suspect is in lots of places in the world. And our way of dealing with it is probably more brutal, partly because we're really still a relatively young nation. And our understanding of ourselves is limited in ways that perhaps they shouldn't be. I know this is a scattered episode, and I know it presents some difficult and kind of thorny questions, but I really appreciate anybody who stuck with me through this, because I think we need to confront this idea of thinking that there's a superior type of human. Because in public school, almost all the time I worked there wasn't such a thing. There were popular humans, but those were not limited to one group or another. That's it for today. I hope you have a great day. It's really pretty outside today. And I hope you see me again, you gorgeous people.